the Harappan civilization, one of the oldest civilizations on the Indian subcontinent, right? The Bronze Age civilization, where we had yesterday a presentation on that topic too. Then we looked at Vedic culture and Vedic civilization, and we discussed what we mean by Vedas and what are the kinds of books and what consists of Vedic literature. We also had a sample of how Vedic mantras are recited, right? And we looked at Nasadiya Sukta and Purush Sukta, and we discussed Ishopnishad, right? And we read that out, and we saw how the thematically also there is a development. So Vedic corpus indicates a historical growth, right, from something like 1500 before Christ to 500 before Christ. So 1000 years of history is what is indicated by uh, uh, Vedic corpus. And we looked at various texts, and that is what we discussed. Then we looked at certain things like Vedanga, that is various kinds of supporting knowledge disciplines for Vedas, right? And that included things like grammar, Nirukta, Chanda, Shiksha, that is pronunciation, and all that. We also discussed Sanskrit poetics, right? Where we discussed Rasa Sutra from Natya Shastra, whose dates are unknown, maybe around the turn of the around the turn of the Common Era, that is somewhere between 3rd century and 2nd century after Christ. And we discussed Rasa Nishpatti, what is difference between Rasa and Bhav. We discussed Alankar Shastra as well, right? We discussed Dhwani. We also discussed some of the important epics of India, right? And we looked at the Sanskrit epics like Ramayana and the Mahabharata. We discussed the stories, themes, and certain kinds of important issues involved in those epics. We also looked at Tamil epics, right? Mani Mekalai and Silapatikaram. We looked at, if you remember, Sangam literature and Tamil poetics as well, right? So our understanding of Indian art, Indian aesthetics is more inclusive than just merely Sanskrit aesthetics and Sanskrit epics or Sanskrit texts. So we discussed those Akkam and Puram poems, and we discussed Sangam literature, right? These are some of the things that we have discussed in Indian literature and culture thing. And we also discussed playwrights like Kalidas. We just touched upon it. I also showed you that some of the handouts that we had given out from the epics, from the Vedic corpus, from the Sangam age literature, from the epics like Mani Mekalai, Silapatikaram, and so on. So that is a kind of overview of the work that we have done till now, right? And we looked at it in this historical context, that how after 5th century before Christ, there is the whole process of called second urbanization, right? And this process of second urbanization, first urbanization happened almost 1000 years before second urbanization. And the first urbanization is, of course, the Harappan civilization. The second urbanization, which happened away from geographical location of first urbanization, is in the Gangetic Valley. And we saw the rise of Mahajanapadas. And one of the major Mahajanapada is Magad. And Magad became a very powerful empire. And one of the most powerful dynasty to rule from Magad is Mauryan, right? And Mauryans were great patrons of Buddhism. So we also looked at Buddhists and Jain and heterodox traditions of Indian philosophy and religion, where you look at how Buddhism is different from Vedic Brahmanism, for that matter, and how Jainism is also very different. And we also look at certain commonalities between these various uh, traditions, right? Uh, that is a kind of overview of what we have been discussing till now. And we find that during the epic time, the periods of epics, you have major sampradayas or panthas, right? Not to be confused with sect, because sect is a very Christian idea where you have a church and there are various denominations of sects which differ or protest against the Roman Catholic or the Central Church. In Vedic Dharma, you don't have that central church, right? You have various pantha or sampradaya. Pantha would be something like uh, roads to salvation or roads to ultimate release, right? And we find Shaivism, Vaishnavism becoming two predominant sampradayas uh, by the turn of the century. And you also have the Devi sampradaya. So Devi or Shakti, along with Shaiva Vaishnav, are the three major developments of the epic period. Uh,
I was saying 1 month ago to share the question है.
huh?
प्रश्न देने के लिए 1 महीने पहले कहा था.
Acha. Actually, can you talk to the head there?
I already discussed.
Acha. But I am in a class just now.
Okay.
So maybe after a couple of at 3 or so. Yeah. Yeah. So these three major forms of worship, right, gave rise to various kinds of discursive traditions like the Puranas. And you have Shiv Puran, you have Vishnu Puran, you have Bhagavad Puran, and so on and so forth, the Puranic tradition. So, and by that time, you also notice that there is a shift in Vedic Hinduism. The early Vedic Hinduism, Hinduism is not the proper term for it. Let's call it Vedic Dharma, right? So, Vedic Dharma would be around some of the deities that we hardly worship today, right? And they are Indra. Indra is the chief deity of the Vedic pantheon, followed by Agni and Varun and Mitra and Rudra and all others like Ashwin Kumars and Saraswati, and the reverse like yeah, Vedic Dharma and Hinduism. Okay, good question. Actually, Hinduism is a term that came into circulation in the 19th century, right? Because earlier it would be more of Vedic Dharma or Sanatan Dharma as it was called. Hindu is the uh, uh, category of description used by people who are outsider, like the Greeks, right? They would say that people living on that side of Indus River, that is the Sindhu River. So people who live on the other side of Sindhu River would be Sindhus, and in Greek, Sa becomes her. So Hindus. That's how it. But it became a prominent category of self-description only in 13th or 14th century, right? So Hindu would be the term you find in Kabir and in the Bhakti poets. They would use the word Hindu, but Hindu as ism, right? As if it's some sort of religion like Christianity or something like that, right? Or Judaism, eh, Mohammedanism, Hinduism. So that was the term that came into prominence only in the 19th century, right? Uh, Earlier, it would be Vedic Dharma. That would be the simplest description of today's Hinduism, right? But it's very complex because it does not have any central core text, nor does it have any central figure, right? There are many important texts, many important doctrines, many important figures, right? It's a kind of cluster of beliefs, doctrines, faiths, forms of worship, rather than a kind of single text prophet oriented kind of religion that you find in Central Asia, like Christianity, would be around the figure of Christ, around Bible, and around the Roman Catholic Church, from where you you protest against it and become Protestant, right? Or Judaism would be around the central text and the prophets like Moses and Abraham. And Islam would be the latest of these Abrahamic religions, as they are called, where you have Prophet Muhammad as the final, right, prophet, and the Quran as the final word of God, right? So in 8th century or so, you find the rise of Islam in Central Asia, West Asia, uh, Iraq, Iran, but today. So religious developments differ from places to place history. So Greek civilization, Greek religion would be very pantheistic, where you have whole pantheon of gods around Zeus, right? Egyptian religion would also be very pantheistic. Uh, what is called Hinduism today was also worship of several gods and deity around cluster of ideas, practices, beliefs, doctrines. So it was a cluster rather than a single uh, uh, formulated doctrine, right? It was multiplicity. And who is a Hindu becomes a problem for everybody to decide. So it is a contested territory. So somebody who does not believe in any of these things can still be a Hindu, right? By birth. Or somebody may become Hindu by just saying you are Hindu, right? As self-description. So it's a complex territory. You cannot use the same criteria as Judaism or Islam or Christianity to understand uh, the Vedic Dharma, as well as the multiplicity of dharmas that you find on Indian subcontinent, like Jainism, like Buddhism, right? So technically, Jainism and Buddhism are not considered as part of Hinduism. They are considered, even in Indian constitution, they are given minority status, right? Because they don't believe in the core principles of Vedic dharma, that is, considering Vedas as eternal, right, or the ultimate truth. So Buddhas reject that basic principle. So they are not called, they are not followers of Vedic dharma. So that's a complex problem, right, Jaswin? But a very important question. Good that you raised. Does that help you? We take a historical perspective to sort matters out for ourselves, right? Okay. So going back to our conversation, we find the rise of Puranic Hinduism, which is very different from Vedic ancient Vedic Dharma, right? So Puranic Vedic Dharma, if that's the category to be used, is something that you find being practiced even today, right? Where you find temples and date idols, but in ancient Vedic Dharma, you did not have idols or temples, or even the gods like Vishnu and Krishna would not be the most important gods in the ancient Vedic pantheon, right? So there is a shift that has happened towards Puranic religions, and there is a rise of various sampradayas that happened. All this seems to happen around the time of the Sanskrit epics, around the turn of civilization, around the turn of 2nd century before Christ, right? Uh, and by the time you reach, so earliest religious architecture in India would be the Bauddha architecture, right? So you will find stupas, you find caves, and you find lot of places which are of Buddha interest. So earliest Indian architecture in India is Buddhist, and idols of Buddhas were made very late in the age of Kanishka probably, and Kanishka and the Kushans were the Central Asian tribes who were driven into the heartland of India, and they became rulers of North India, right? By defeating the Greeks, Indo-Greeks, uh, in the northwestern part of India around Afghanistan and Pakistan. So that area was ruled by Indo-Greeks, right? And all these Indo-Greeks as well as Kushans were the followers of Buddhism. Uh, so one of the great important texts in Buddhism is Milinda Panho, or Questions of Milinda. So it talks about dialogues between the King Milinda and sage, a Buddhist monk, uh, on philosophical issues. And Milinda is actually King Meander of Greece, right? He's a Greek king. So Kushans were Central Asian tribes called Yuche, right? And they were great patrons of Buddhism and in other Vedic dharma as well. So, and this Greek encounter led to first sculpture of human figure in India of Buddha being modeled on Greek sculpture. So what is known as Gandhar art, right? That is, we are talking of a period between 2nd century BC to 3rd century AD. ये 500 साल की बात कर रहे हैं, क्रिश्चियन एरा के पहले 2 सेंचुरी और उसके बाद की 3 सेंचुरी ऐसे, राइट? सो गांधार आर्ट इज a very important development. Gandhar is what is today's Afghanistan, and this art was deeply influenced by Greek art. So by the time you come to 4th century onwards, with the rise of what is known as the Gupta Empire, right? You find that temples start being built on a bigger scale. Puranic religion becomes consolidated, right? Uh, and Vedic Brahmanism is also being promoted by the Guptas. And this is the period in which you have great playwrights like Kalidas and Tansen, and who, not, I'm very sorry, not Tansen. Kalidas and other 9 jewels of Chandragupta II's kingdom, court. Right. So this is the period of great Sanskrit literature. It is in this era that you find consolidation of Varna system, and texts like Manusmriti are being composed, right? The Gupta period. And this is the period of important knowledge texts being composed in India in Sanskrit. So Sanskrit, which was a language largely of liturgy and mantra and brahmana, and the epics, start becoming the language of kings. And we find that kings start putting up their inscriptions in Sanskrit, and you also have Laukika Sahitya coming up. Laukika in the sense worldly literature, like literature that you and I study. And the earliest one epic that we have omitted, right? You can see how omissions happen in a canon, is Ashwaghosh and his great epic Buddha Charitra, right? So it's a Mahakavya based on Buddha, Buddha's life written in Sanskrit. So Buddhists also started composing in Sanskrit. So that is the period that we have looked at. These are the things that we have touched upon. Right, now we want to move ahead. Now we want to turn a page in history to the period after the collapse of Gupta Empire, right? And Gupta Empire was ravaged by another stream of mlechas. Mlechas are people who are outside of Varna system, right? The outsiders were called mlechas. And so earliest mlechas would be the Greeks, followed by uh, the Yuchis, the Kushans, right? And now you have one more Central Asian tribe which is driven away by Chinese rulers, is the Huns. And the Hunas attacked the Gupta Empire, right? Leading to in weakening of Gupta Empire and collapse of Gupta Empire, right? And the Hunas also then adopt Indian social order and culture, right? King Tormana. Other mlechas who became part of Indian society were Shakas, right? Scythians. And they had a very different kind of political system. And one of the most famous Scythian or Shaka is Rudradaman, who is believed to have built a great tank at Patan. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. So Shakas, Huns, Kushans, Greeks were the outsiders who entered Indian society and became part of it. So you can see how Indian society is made up of various ethnicities coming and mingling and being part of uh, the genetic cocktail that all of us are today. So as we proceed further, we find that in the 7th century, a new religion has emerged very powerfully in Central Asia, and that is Islam, right? Under the Prophet Muhammad, and who is revealed the God's words, and that expands over large parts of Asia, right? Including uh, the Arabs. So one of the earliest ethnicities to enter India was the Arabs. One of the earliest Muslim ethnicities to enter India were the Arabs, right? In the north uh, western part of India. And then you have Central Asian Turks who came in a massive scale. And these Turks from Central Asia, who were many of them were Muslims, established a dynasty called uh, the Delhi Sultanate of several dynasties, right? Including the slave dynasties. You might have heard of Muhammad Taghlaq and Alauddin Khilji, and all these Turkish, actually they are ethnically Turks, right? Though they follow Islam, they are ethnically Turks. Came and conquered large portions of Indian subcontinent, right? Later in the 16th century, we find that these uh, Turks were defeated by a Mongol dynasty, especially started by Babur, that is 16th century, right? And Babur was half Mongol, half Turk kind of king. So he would trace his ancestry to Taimur and others, and on the other side he would trace himself to. So he's a kind of mixture of Turk and Mongols, establishing Mughal dynasty, right? So what is important here, and this dynasty becomes powerful for 2.5 centuries, 2 centuries. It becomes the biggest empire on the subcontinent, the Mughals, after 16th century onwards. And it's one of the most prosperous empires in the world, right? So if you look at the economy of the world at that time, then 26% of global economy was controlled by the Mughals. And China was on decline. Chinese empire was also a very powerful and rich and uh, influential empire. Uh, so you find that Europe is nowhere to be seen in all these stories, right? Because uh, uh, one famous story goes that Sir Thomas Roe, who comes with East India Company, has to seek audience with Emperor Jahangir, and he is made to wait for several days, and he has to give gifts. तो ही उसको अंदर मिलने देते. So that was the power of the Mughal emperor, right, at that time. So later we find people like Portuguese, French, Dutch, and British enter Indian subcontinent for business, right? And there are great wars between them for controlling the business, for controlling the land on Indian subcontinent, out of which the British company called the East India Company is the victor, right? So if you look at what we have discussed just now, we have started out with the collapse of Gupta period, and we have come to the beginning of the 18th century. So almost 1000 years of history we have just touched upon very briefly, kind of uh, uh, rough outline of it, right? And all this you are familiar in your school, you have studied all these things in your school, so there is nothing new that I'm adding to it. So how does all this matter to the student of Indian literature and culture, right? How does this all histories matter? Then with the establishment of British Empire, starting with the East India Company, certain narratives came to be created regarding history of India, right? And the earliest historians of India, like John Stuart Mill, a British scholar, drew up a kind of story of Indian history, right? Where you have ancient Hindu period of golden age, followed by the dark age of Islamic age, and finally the British and a coming of enlightenment in India. This was the three-tiered narrative that the British colonial historians created. And if you look at this historical narrative, then you will realize that this narrative in some way justifies colonialism, right? How does it justify colonialism? How does it justify British rule over India? Then, uh, by saying that we are the saviors who rescued you from Islamic barbarians, those dark age, we are the saviors. Your culture is in decline and decadence. We come to save you, right? You are our burden. We come to enlighten you. We have come to modernize you, because in ancient days there was this great golden age, the Hindu age. Then with the coming of Islam, there is a decline of the golden age, and British have come in to save you and take you back to the golden age, right? Back to the era of enlightenment. So this kind of narrative that the British colonial historians created served two purposes. One, it justified why British are there in India. हम क्यों आए? आपको बचाने के लिए आए इन लोगों से, राइट? ये जो वैशी लोग हैं उनसे बचाने के लिए हम enlightened लोग हैं. That is one. Second is to create a kind of divide between the Muslim population and the Hindu population, right? By saying that Islamic rule and Muslims are responsible for decadence of India. That creates a deep enmity between two substantial populations of India. So this colonial narrative, right, served two purposes: justification of colonial rule, and secondly, division which allows you to rule in the population, right? So you can see how colonial narrative of Indian history that the British historians created had an ulterior political agenda, right? And this kind of agenda was accepted by some of the Indian intellectuals as well. Indian nationalist intellectuals accepted this narrative, and that's where the problems begin. So along with John Stuart Mill, you have other historians called Eliot and Dowson. These two historians wrote a two-volume history of India according to its own historians. History of India according to her own historians. And in that, they selected historians from various Islamic regimes, various regimes like the Sultanate, the Mughals, right? Afghans and Turks. So there were several ethnicities, and they took the historical narratives of those historians who were on the payroll of sultans, right? They were being paid by the sultan ने रखे हुए historians है खुद की वाहवाही के लिए, right? And they produced a very exaggerated narrative of mass conversion, rape, and destruction of temples, right? In order to glorify their own sultans and as great upholders of Islam. That's the kind of narrative that they created, Eliot and Dowson. So the problem with this narrative was all these exaggerated accounts of destruction of thousands and thousands of temples and rape and barbaric acts of conversion. There were on ground hardly any evidence for that, right? Given the fact that the Muslim population was minority in those days, there is a limit to which you can cross, right? Impose your religion on others. You cannot do that even in 13th century. There is a limit. Five people cannot force 100 people to do something, right? Uh, some historians, modern historians like Richard Eaton has made an actual survey of how many temples were broken and how conversions happened during this era. And he drew up a list of 80 temples which were destroyed by various kinds of sultans, right? I'm saying various kinds of sultan because even if they were Muslims, they were of various ethnicities, like Afghans, like Turks, like Pathans, like Iranians, that is Persians, like Central Asian Turks, and so on, and even African slaves called Habshis, right? Uh, so all these ethnicities, actual 80 temples were broken. He draws up that list and he says that they were not broken out of some theological program, right? They were not following any theological program, but their program was political. By breaking a temple, you discredit a king who you are fighting. For example, the great temple of Pandharpur, right, in Maharashtra, or Somnath. Somnath was plundered largely for huge monetary benefits that the plunderer would take, right? So the real agendas were political and economic of plundering, basically, right? Rather than theological program of destroying all the temples. All the temples are not destroyed. So the point that I'm trying to make, that the picture is far more complex, right, and nuanced than certain kind of narratives floated by the colonial historians allow us to see that, right? So British rule was not called Christian rule, right? So why should that era of several ethnicities be called Islamic age, right? It was not Islamic age because British era is not Christian era. I hope you get that. They were following Christianity, but you don't say that India was under Christian rule. We say under British rule, right? Uh, in similar way, you have Arabs and Afghans and Central Asian and what else? All sorts of. And the evidence for it that all these ethnicities were hardly living in peace with each other. If religion could unite them, they would have been united. they were constantly at war with each other, and that disturbed Indian society substantially, right? And very interesting. So one of my interesting figures from this era is Ethiopian slave named Malik Ambar. I don't know how many of you have heard of him. Malik Ambar was African, right, of African ethnicity and race, and he was converted and he was sold, uh, and then he was brought to India, right, in Deccan. And because of his great intelligence, he was allowed to study substantially, and he became a leader of the Habshis, that means the African slaves who were brought on Deccan, and he became a mercenary. But then he started controlling the Ahmednagar Sultanate, right? And he kept a puppet king over there. And neither Jahangir nor other sultanates liked him. So they decided to fight him. All the sultanates, Mughals, uh, Bijapur Sultanate, and so on, right? There were five uh, factions. They got together to defeat Malik Ambar, but he single-handedly defeated them all, right? And he prevented Mughals from taking over the Ahmednagar Sultanate. It's only after his death that Akbar could capture Ahmednagar, right? So the point I'm making is that it was largely for sake of money and power that battles were constantly being fought on the subcontinent, right? And how will you look at person like Malik Ambar through Hindu versus Muslim narrative, right? Because here is uh, an Ethiopian soldier, right, who converted to some form of Islam, and he fought all other sultanates and Mughals in India and defeated them. What is more important, right? He also built certain kinds of irrigation systems that still exist in Aurangabad. So if you go to Aurangabad today, you will find Ambari Nehar, right? Uh, Water system that were highly advanced for its time. Uh, so the point I'm making is that you cannot slot the period from 11th century to 18th century as Mughal age or Islamic age, because this is completely inaccurate historically, right? They are not all the same, and you cannot look at it from Hindu versus Muslim kind of equation. That is something that we have to keep in mind. We have to also be careful by looking at the exaggerated accounts given by the historians of those period, who just wanted to flatter their sultan to no end, right? So we have to be careful and take a nuanced view of this whole period. Get rid of colonial perspectives on this. We have to decolonize our view of history, right? And the problem is that if we adopt this colonial narrative of history for ourselves, we are uh, creating tough time for ourselves, right? So this is the historical view of these 1000 years, from the collapse of Gupta Empire to the establishment of the British rule in a nutshell. And we are going to look at literature of this period, which is the reason why I discussed this at length, right? One of the most important feature of this period is rise of vernacular literatures, right? Rise of literatures in Tamil, Kannada, in Marathi, Gujarati, Bangla, Hindi, what is called Hindi. It was actually called Hindavi or Hindui in those days. Various uh, languages like Punjabi and so on and so forth, right? The vernacular literatures are emerging in this period, which is a very important development for us. The earlier literature that we saw was largely written in cosmopolitan languages like Sanskrit, Apabhransh, and Prakrit, which would include Pali as well, right? There is newer languages which emerge from the Apabhransh and Prakrits, right? So you have 3 or 4 kind of periods of Indian languages: the ancient Sanskrit, Vedic Sanskrit, classical Sanskrit, right? After Panini, then you have the Apabhransh and Prakrit period, and fourth is the modern Indian languages, right? So it is called modern Indo-Aryan phase of languages, which includes Bangla, Gujarati, Punjabi, Tamil, Hindi, all the languages that we speak at home, right? It's called modern Indo-Aryan phase. So this is the historical phase, and this is uh, a very important development for us, right? We find that regional languages start growing more and more powerful, right? And they are called vernaculars. Uh, Now, the problem with the term vernacular is that it was used in classical European paradigm to talk about language of the slaves, right? It was the गुलामों की language. So you would have Latin and उनके गुलामों की भाषा कोई और होगी. So that vernacular यानी गुलामों की भाषा. When we use it in Indian context, we have to be careful that we don't use this meaning of word vernacular, right? By vernacular, you mean language of the people, language in which you buy your potatoes and you buy your chai, language in which you curse your friends, right? So that's vernacular. And vernacular is a relative term. For example, in Europe, English, German, French, Spanish would be vernaculars, right? And classical languages would be Greek and Latin, right? But when English comes to India, it becomes elite, powerful language. It no longer remains vernacular. So status of language when it goes to other places changes, right? So if somebody says that why do you call Gujarati vernacular? Then you can say that English is also vernacular in Europe. It is the language that people use, spoken language, right? That is what vernacular means. That means it has lower status than the classical and the elite languages of the time. Anything you have to say about what I have said just now? Kuch samajh mein nahi aaya, you want me to clarify something, any point, any doubts that you have?
I have 10 minutes.
I have a class, so after my class,
At what time?
3:30 or so. Doubts, queries, कुछ नहीं है. Shall we move ahead then? Shall we move forward? Or you have gone to sleep? How did slaves rise to the position of power? A good question, Jaswin. Even in Delhi Sultanate, if you know, there is one slave dynasties, right? Mamluks. Yes. How did slave? You have to understand that slavery means different thing over here. Slavery in the Atlantic part, the American North Atlantic slave trade, the slaves were completely controlled by their masters, right? They were deprived of all education, all important advantages in life, and they were cruelly suppressed. But these people who were brought as slaves were brought for their loyalty, because an African person of African ethnicity would never become a king in India, right? They would remain loyal, extremely loyal and faithful to their masters, and in return their masters would educate them, train them, right, and also give them leadership skills. So they would become almost like mercenaries who were highly educated elites, right? Ghulam hai, but fir bhi, if you look at Malik Ambar, uh, he's extremely knowledgeable man of great leadership skills, right? So slavery meant several things in several places. There is no fixed meaning of the practice of slavery. You find it in various forms. So Africans being controlled by white Americans or Europeans is a different kind of slavery, right? And so Habshis in India would become very powerful. In fact, they would become rulers of a place called Janjira later on. Habshis, and you also have various Habshis in Gujarat, right? They have adopted all Gujarati customs and languages. So that's how they rose to positions of power, right? Because of they were not deprived of social cultural capital or knowledge. That's how they rose to positions of power. Only in India, right? Just been very good question indeed. You don't find it in Atlantic American context. Razia Sultan being defeated by Ghulam dynasty. I forget the name. Okay. Any other question? Okay. So one prominent feature of these vernacular literatures is the religious vernacular literature produced by various new sampradayas or panth, right? And this whole literature is also called bhakti literature for some reason, right? Because bhakti seems to be, or devotion seems to be, one of the central uh, core ideology of all these religious beliefs. And the idea of bhakti goes back to Bhagavad Gita, right? Where Gita talks of Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga. Bhakti as a form of religion, right? Vernacular form of religion and vernacular body of literature seems to emerge after 8th century, starting with the Tamils again. So Tamil Bhakti movement is one of the earliest movements that happened. So going back to, and you can see why we are discussing Tamil, right? Because its cultural importance is so much. So if you look at Sangam literature, right, going back to 3rd century to 2nd century AD, and Tolkappiyar and Tirukkural, right? And then you have the epics of Manimekalai and Silapatikaram, and these epics are the epics of Jaina and Buddhist faith, right? However, in Tamil Nadu, I think it's in 7th century or so, you have great sectarian resurgence of bhakti. There are Shaiva saints called Nayanars and Vaishnavites called Namalvars, right? And they produce a huge body of literature which is extremely fascinating. Namalvars and Nayanars. And there are dozens of Nayanvar saints and Namalvar saints. Very often in protest against Jainism, Buddhism, as well as the rigidities of Varna, right? So bhakti seems to emerge in a major way, vernacular bhakti movement in Tamil Nadu. Then you have similar resurgence coming up in Karnataka, right? Where by 13th century you have Basaveshwara movement called the Sharana movement in Kannada. And these Sharanas were the followers of the Veerasaiva religion, right? Veerasaiva is a certain South Indian version of Shaivism, and Shaivism has various kind of religious regional coordinates. For example, in Kashmir, you have a certain kind of Shaivism being practiced, and here you have a different form of Shaivism uh, called Veerashaivas, right, of various acharyas. And from that, there is a kind of powerful reformist oriented movement called Sharana movement. And they write substantial number of vachanas, right? And Basaveshwara is the leader of this movement. It is believed that when Basaveshwara was probably born in a Brahmin family, but when his uh, when the time came for this sacrificial thread ceremony came, he rejected that, right? He rejected the Vedic Brahminism very powerfully, and uh, the Varna system associated with it, and he inaugurated a kind of powerful movement of which people like Mahadevi Akka uh, and many others, right? Alama Prabhu and others were the leaders and the composers. So that's the another important development from Tamil Nadu to Karnataka. You have similar movements coming up in Maharashtra with people like Jnaneshwara, right? Another Brahmin who was outcasted, and he wrote a commentary of Gita in Marathi called Jnaneshwari, which becomes a very powerful text for uh, the Varkari Sampradaya, right? So you have Sharana Sampradaya, Varkari Sampradaya, Namalwars, Alwars, and so on. And in Gujarat, by 15th century, you have a person like Narsi Mehta becoming a prominent bhakti poet of the time. One of the early bhakti poets called Namadev, right, went to the north and he inaugurated the Sant tradition in the north as well, right? So you can see how bhakti is traveling from several places. Uh, and Namadev was a tailor. So according to the traditional classification of Varna, he was a Shudra, right? So he was denied certain kind of religious privileges and entitlements, and he protested against that by emphasizing the religion of heart, religion of bhakti, right, which is about passionate singing and involvement with the deity. Uh, Later on in Gujarat, you have from north, you have a great bhakti poet called Mirabai coming to Gujarat, right? And from Braj. You also have Kabir, right? And you have Ravidas. You have many other important bhakta poets. So this is the beginning of what is known as the bhakti movement, though we don't understand it like that today. But this is a kind of efflorescence of great oral, vernacular, spiritual, religious literature. And you can see, and the problem with calling this literature is large body of it is oral literature. For example, Kabir or Namdev would hardly know how to write, probably. Kabir did not know how to write, right? So they orally composed it, and this was transmitted orally through their followers, right? Some of it was written, large body of it was unwritten, it was oral. So Narsi Mehta has not written anything. It's mostly the oral compositions which were written down 100 years after his death. Manuscripts you find, right? So this is what is known as the Bhakti period, right? Any questions about bhakti? Anything that you have to say? Any questions? No? Okay. So what was this bhakti, right? And other name for it is Sant Vangmaya or Sant Sahitya, right? So what is this Santa tradition is something that we need to look at a bit closely. If you go back to the period where we were discussing Puranic literature and the emergence of three major panthas, Puranic panthas, right? Shaiva, Vaishnava, and Shakta. Later on, from that emerged another kind of religious, what should I say, religious formation called the Tantras. And Tantras were in many ways different from Vedic Brahmanism because they emphasized vernacular languages. They emphasized people from all caste could be the religious leaders, spiritual leaders of that movement, Tantras, right? And their emphasis was on a very different kind of religious practices, spiritual practices, which included yoga, but also included many other things which were forbidden or not considered as part of pure yoga, right? So Tantra is a new religious formation, 6th century onwards. That is very important. And it is called Tantra because it is, uh, uh, the texts were called Tantras, right? And they included practices like mantra, but these mantras were not Vedic mantras, right? These were new mantras. And the most important aspect of Tantra is the importance of Guru, right? If you look at Rama and Mahabharata, you find Acharya, right? Or in Vedic period, you find Acharya who gives knowledge to his disciples. But Guru is a somebody who initiates you into certain kind of esoteric religious practice. And by esoteric practice, you mean that it is not open for all. It is a closed kind of practice, religious rituals and practices uh, around the theory of what is known as Kundalini. I don't know if you have heard of this. Have you heard of this? Kundalini. Kundalini is the core idea is that your body is a microcosm of this universe, right? Universe is a macrocosm. Your body is microcosm. It's like Pinda and Brahmanda, right? So that so the energy of this entire universe in a micro form, microcosmic form, lives in human body in the form of a serpent, right? Coiled serpent at the base of your spine. And through various practices and disciplines, right, under the guidance of the guru, this energy is to be raised and it is to be taken to the ultimate, uh, what should I say, ultimate destination of this energy, that is the crown, human crown, the head, right? And all the intermediary stages would be called chakras. So it rises from the base of your spine and goes up to your uh, crown, right? Resulting in enlightenment, immediate enlightenment. And in the process, when it is taken upward through certain rigorous disciplines and certain practices, people get magical powers or siddhis of all kinds as it proceeds. Now, you might have heard of this. How many of you have heard of this? How many of you have heard of Kundalini and Chakra? No one. Jia has heard, okay. Sneha has heard, okay. Hmm. So this becomes one of the important aspects of Tantra, right? And Tantra also develops a kind of set of practices called Vam Marga. Vam Marga is the left-handed Tantra, which is doing, which is about practicing those things which are forbidden by the mainstream religions, right? Mainstream. uh, so that would include what is known as Panchamakar sadhana, that is mantra, mudra, maithuna. Maithuna is sex, right? Madira or even liquor, alcohol, right? And so on. So using just and mandala or the drawings which are esoteric. So esoteric यानी जो कुछ ही लोगों के लिए होता है, सबके लिए नहीं. So unlike the acharya of the Vedic times or the acharya of the epics, guru is a person who initiates you into all these esoteric secret rites, right, of sadhana. So guru becomes central to the tantric philosophy, along with the whole sadhana of of Kundalini. So from that you also have a section of people who are called siddhas, right? Siddha yani jo people who have accomplished, right? Who are now adepts, who have uh, taken their Kundalini to the last chakra, Sahasrahar, and they have become Jivan Mukta, right? They have got the ultimate release right now, and they have got all siddhis or superpowers, right? So Siddha was another sampradaya from it, a kind of aspect of it. However, uh, and it was patronized by merchants and kings massively, right? Because it included things that conventional religions did not allow. So kings would like it, right? For example, licentiousness of sexual behavior, right? Would something that rich people would enjoy. So a lot of these things entered tantra, and need was felt to purify it. So you have a development within that, within Siddha tradition called the Nath tradition. So you have these Navanaths as they are called. So Nath tradition is the tradition of Siddhas, right? In many ways, who also practice Tantra minus all these unconventional practices, forbidden practices, they would try to get rid of. So that is the Nath tradition. And from but most important thing about Tantra is that the guru can be of lower caste as well. Now this is a great development, right? If you look at the epics and the Vedic period, the gurus were largely from the three major varnas. But in Tantra, you have a certain kind of openness in terms of caste, and gurus can be a Shudra can be a guru, right? So while many Brahmins adopted Tantra, many people did not like it as well, right? Uh, and the use of vernacular languages, right? So that by the time you reach the 11th century or 12th century, you have figures like Gorakhnath, right? One of the great Nathas. And from that begins all these Nathas and Siddhas are renunciates, right? They have given up Gruhasthashram. They don't have families. But when this philosophy takes a Gruhastha turn, there emerges a kind of religious system called Bhakti, right? So Bhakti is often situated against this renunciate tantric and Siddha traditions. So there is a tension between two very often. So Bhakti is mostly the Santas are people from mostly people from lower castes or unknown castes, right? Like Kabir, who is Julaha, or Namdev, who is Shimpi, and so on and so forth. Tukaram, who is Avani or a grocer, considered Shudra, and so on and so forth, right? So people from lower caste, Ravidas, who was a cobbler. So people from the lower strata of society could become major religious leaders. All of them have families, right? And for them, uh, the primary goal of life, that is Paramartha, is not through Tantra and Sadhana, but through Bhakti. So intense devotion and singing in praise of that your deity is primary to Bhakti, right? So you can see the historical unfolding of this. So this is how we reach the Bhakti period. Anything that you have to say about what we discussed? Tell me if you're not understood something, or you're any queries. Okay, Kundalini. It's not Kundalini is coils. That serpent energy, the cosmic energy is imagined to be part of human body, right? Not physical body, but a subtle sukshma there, in form of this energy at the base of your spine. And through sadhana, that is the disciplinary ritualistic practices, and through discipline, you have to raise that energy to your forehead, above your forehead, to the last chakra, that is Sahasrara chakra, right? So that is the practice that Tantra considered to be central, and it has to be done only under the guidance of Guru, right? It's an esoteric practice, and through when you raise this serpentine energy, it's imagined as a serpent. It gives you various kinds of superpowers, siddhis. You can be small as an ant, you can be huge as a mountain, you can be invisible, you can see past, future, and present, Trikal Darshan, right? And so on.
तो सर वो जो हमारी वो जन्माक्षर वाली भी एक कुंडली होती है ना?
नहीं, वो कुंडली है, ये कुंडलिनी है. कुंडली यानी
Okay.
हॉरोस्कोप, राइट? दैट इज पार्ट ऑफ ज्योतिष, राइट?
So that
कुंडलिनी.
topic doesn't comes in this.
पार्डन? हॉरोस्कोप
वो टॉपिक हमारे में नहीं आता.
आता है, मगर मुझे नहीं आता वो. मैं कुंडली, मुझे इंडियन ज्योतिष नहीं आता.
मतलब वो लिटरेचर का पार्ट नहीं है ना?
लिटरेचर का पार्ट हो सकता है, क्योंकि यू नो व्हाट, लॉट ऑफ वैदिक रिचुअल्स हैज टू बी कंसिडर, और एनी रिचुअल्स और एनी फेस्टिवल्स you have to do by following panchanga, right? And very often the characters in all the stories, religious stories, would encounter difficulties because of their karma in their past life. So Jyotish would be part of it, though not directly. So, right? And history of Jyotish is a different subject. इतनी गहराई में हम अभी नहीं जा रहे at first year. But Kundalini is this serpentine energy, cosmic energy, in form of serpent, which is coiled. ऐसे बैठे हुए हैं आपके रीढ़ के हड्डी के नीचे, और उसे ऊपर उठाना होता है लास्ट चक्र तक, चक्र को भेदना होता है. That is what it talks about. That is one of the important philosophies of Tantra. Why is Tantra known mostly with sexual connotation, right? Very good question. That is because mostly Americans sold it as a sex manual, right? Which it was not. It's largely product of American marketing. Just like yoga is about health and well-being, ऐसे वो market किया गया, but yoga is about spiritual realization, right? Where only one part of it is asana and pranayama. The Ashtanga Yoga of Patanjali has the 8 limbs, starting with yama and niyama, that is discipline and following rules. That is primary. Morality, ethics, morality, discipline, ये core है योगा का. Second is niyama, then asan, pranayam, pratyahar, and samadhi, right? That is how Patanjali's yoga. Now, it is not about fitness and reducing weight or curing diseases primarily, but that is how it is marketed today. So Tantra is marketed today as some sort of sexual practice, but it is not. It is about spiritual realizations, right? It is part of sadhana. It is not about increasing your pleasure as Americans would like to market it. That's why Tantra is associated, unfortunately, with sex. And that connects to the left-handed way of Tantra, Vampantha. Vampantha was just one aspect of Tantra. Not all Tantra is about sex. Right? And Americans want novelty. Market में नया कुछ चाहिए तो Tantra, Kam Sutra, as if it's a sex manual, but it's not. It's about one of the purposes of human life, one of the Purushartha, that is Kama. And tantrics are also believed to be black magician. So all this negative imagery associated with tantra seems to take off after 12th, 13th century. So if you look at bhakti poetry, then it is in vernaculars. It expresses its intense devotion for God, right? And it has certain rejections of the rigidities of caste, varna, and gender in the path of devotion. It has no place for all these things in devotion, right? So you find that. So we will start looking at various kind of bhakti poetry from our next class. कुछ पूछना है आपको? Any other doubt? Gia is asking, do we have some handout material for this? Yes, I will give you that, right? Though some of the books I have already given to you. Publication divisions की कुछ book देखते हो अगर आप तो उसमें है already.
And sir, do we have written exam for this?
Yes. So that I will inform you how to go about it, right? See, if you have taken look at syllabus देखा है आप लोगों ने कैसे assessment होगा, formative और summative. Formative में 3 टाइप के हैं, एक प्रेजेंटेशन है, दूसरा प्रोजेक्ट्स है और तीसरा मिड सेम है. तीनों के मिलाकर 50 मार्क होते हैं. एंड सेम 50 मार्क जो एग्जाम होगी, राइट? आई हैव रिटन दैट. आई डोंट नो इफ यू हैव रेड इट. आपने पढ़ा है कि नहीं सिलेबस? देखा कि नहीं आप लोगों ने? हाँ ना, कितने लोगों ने देखा है वो? ये फिर से मैं रिपोस्ट कर रहा हूँ कुछ जो मैंने पहले पोस्ट कर दिया था। मतलब फिर से देखो खोल के। Okay, so let me repost some of the things. अब 20 मार्क का प्रोजेक्ट है आपको, राइट? और उसके मैं आपको टॉपिक्स दे रहा हूं। प्रोजेक्ट में आपको प्रेजेंटेशन नहीं करना है, आपको सिर्फ लिख के मुझे भेजना है, राइट? 10 पेजेस तक का आर्टिकल आपको लिख के भेजना है।
तो सर हमारा अभी जो प्रेजेंटेशन था वो 20 मार्क्स का था।
10 मार्क्स का था। लिखा है, देखो ना, आप खोल के देखो वहां पे। ऑल दैट इज गिवन टू यू इन द बिगिनिंग।
Sir, can you give a word limit instead of
Word
page?
limit would be roughly 2000 words, right? I'm giving you the
Okay.
uh, topics. Wait. Where is it?
सर प्लीज रिपोस्ट कर दीजिए ना, आपको खुल नहीं रहा है।
क्या नहीं खुल रहा है?
वो जो आपने भेजा था ना इंट्रोडक्शन के लिए, हमारा जो सिलेबस।
हाँ, सिलेबस क्यों नहीं खुल रहा है? ओके
पता नहीं सर, ओपन नहीं हो रहा है।
ओके, लेट मी सी। Repost it. Okay, here it is. Okay, so I'm putting it here in the group. I'm putting it, right? Did you get this syllabus मिला आपको?
यस सर।
अब मैं आपको प्रोजेक्ट के टॉपिक भेजता हूँ। Now take a look at the topics for project, right? That I have sent. Can you see this topics? Can you see this?
यस सर।
You have to write one essay, right? ऑन एनी ऑफ दीज। ये 11 में से कोई भी एक टॉपिक के ऊपर एक ऐसे लिखना है 2000 वर्ड का, और इन टॉपिक्स में से एक ऐसे लिखना है अप टू 2000 वर्ड्स, एक्सक्लूडिंग फोटोज, इलिस्ट्रेशंस। नीचे किताबें दी गई है और ऑनलाइन साइट्स, वेबसाइट्स जो आप यूज कर सकते हो, राइट। दिस इज फॉर 20 मार्क्स। और आपको मैं आज 4th को आई गिव यू before 25th sharp, right? So I'm giving you 3 weeks, which is lot, right? 3 weeks you have for projects.
Sir, so we have to write 2 essays.
2 essays,
One in A,
one
one
from
in
this topic and one from this set of topics. A में से एक essay लिखना है, दूसरा, and you can include a lot of photographs, illustrations, whatever you want. And these are some of the reference books that you can use. Many of them are available in PDFs, and these are online resources, right? Most of them you can see here. Clear? This is for 20 marks. Any questions regarding this? And those who have not made a presentation, in spite of telling them, means those who have not been allotted presentation, उनको तो 10 मार्क में से कुछ नहीं मिलेंगे, right? People who have not come to the class for that. Those who have made presentations, they will be graded. Clear? Anything?
yes.
कुछ पूछना है, कहना है? Okay, so next week we'll start looking at the Bhakti poets. We'll look at Amir Khusrau and Ravidas and Kabir, right?
Sir, my presentation will be next week, not today.
Yeah, what is it about?
Ravidas.
Actually, we have 10-15 minutes. Are you ready with it, or you want to take more time?
Sir, actually I am ready, but if you are telling that you are starting from next week, so I can.
But I feel, why don't you do it today? 10 minutes से
Okay.
तो नहीं लगेगा ना आपको?
हाँ sir.
हाँ, तो let's do it. So that
Okay, sir.
next time we will discuss it, right?
Okay, sir.
Yeah. Go ahead, Nityam.
Sir, my screen is visible to you.
Yeah. Yes.
Sir, I'm not able to share the screen.
I can see it.
Um,
Now I cannot. Gia, I don't know when your midterm exam will be. I will have to find out from. I will also give you paper style and the dates when I find out, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, is it visible now?
Yeah.
I'm not able to see my
No,
own,
no,
sir.
I can see your phone screen, but I can't see your PPT.
Okay, sir.
Maybe if I make you the now, what if I make you the presenter, something like that? Let me see. I will add you as a co-host, and then I think you can do it.
Yes, sir.
You do right now. Do it again. I have made you the co-host.
Okay, sir.
Are you using a laptop or something?
Sir, I'm using my phone.
Hmm. Now try doing it.
Yes, sir. Sir, is it visible now?
Yes. Now it's better.
Okay. Uh, uh, Good afternoon, sir. My topic is Ravidas and Mahadevi Akka. So basically, they were the part of the Bhakti movement, and they were the Tamil poets. Uh, Sorry, one second. Yes. Basically, Ravidas was an Indian mystic poet saint of Bhakti movement and the founder of Ravidasya religion during the 15th to 16th century. Venerated as a guru, teacher in the religion of basically the state of our India, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, and mainly Punjab and Haryana. He was a poet, a social reformer, and a spiritual figure. Uh, His verses were included in the six scriptures known as Guru Granth Sahib. Medieval era texts such as the Bhakt Mandal suggested that Ravidas was a disciple of the Brahmin Bhakti poet Ramanand. He always used to change society. He used to explain people about the life, teaching people a person should love his neighbor as himself without any discrimination. Um, The details of Ravidas' life are not well known. Scholars state he was born in 14th-50th century and died in 15th to 20th century. Ravidas was known as Raidas also. He was born in the village of Sir Govardhanpur near the Varanasi now it is in Uttar Pradesh. His birthplace is known as Sri Guru Ravidas Janam Sthan. Mata Kansla was his mother and his father was Santok Das. His parents, according to my research, his parents belonged to the leather working Chamar community, making them an untouchable caste. While his original occupation was leather work, he began to spend most of his time in the spiritual pursuits at the bank of the Gangas. Thereafter, he spent most of his life in the company of Sufi saints, sadhus, and ascetics. The medieval era texts such as Bhakt Mandal suggest that Ravidas was the disciple of Brahmin Bhakti poet
Disciple.
Ramanujan.
Disciple.
Disciple, okay. Uh, Ravidas was the Guru Ravidas was the founder of the religion Ravidasia's religion. Uh, it uh, Yes, the Ravidasia's religion, also called Ravidas Panth, is a religion sect founded in the 14th century. It is based on the teaching of the 14th century Guru Ravidas, reversed as the Sat Guru by the Ravidasia's tradition. Historically, Ravidasias represented a range of belief that the Indian subcontinent, with some devotees of Ravidas counting themselves as Ravidasias, but the first formed in the early 20th century is colonial British India. The Ravidasias traditions began to take on the more conscience following 1947 and the establishment of the successful Ravidasias tradition in the diaspora. Estimate range between 2 or 5 million for the total numbers of Ravidasias. Believes that the Ravidas is their guru, whereas the Sikhs were traditionally considered him one of his bhaktas, means the holy person. Further, Ravidas uh, except living sons of Ravidas Dias as Guru. A new Ravidasia's religion was launched following as Ascensions attacked on their visiting live Guru Sant Nirjana. Yes, this I have pasted a picture that depicts the symbol of this religion. The religion is represented by a flag with the insigns of Har, which states Ronki Ram includes a bigger circle with 40 rays of sunlight, signifies 40 hymns of Guru Ravidas. Inside the big circle is a small circle inside which is written Har in a Guru Mukhi language with a flame on the top of it. The flame represents the Nam word that would illuminate the entire world and reaches the outer circle. Between the two circles is written a couplet composed by Ravidas. Uh, yes. The Ravidas religious symbol is known as Har Nishan. Teaching of Ravidas. People says God sent Ravidas ji into the earth to protect religion because at this time things had increased a lot. People used to do apartheid in the name of religion. Ravidas ji bravely faced all the discrimination and explained the true definition of faith and caste to the people. He used to explain to people that man is not known by the faith in the caste, religion, or a god, but he is recognized by his actions. Ravidas ji made a lot of efforts to end the prevalence of untouchability in the society. Message that given by Ravidas is people that God has created man, not a man created a God. This means God created every human being and everyone has an equal right on the earth. Saint Guru Ravidas is used to give various teachings to the people about universal brotherhood and tolerance. Guru Ravidas opposed all activities banned to the lower caste people like Shudras, means untouchables, were not allowed to wear common clothes like Brahmins, such as Janev, tilak on forehead, and other religion practices. How did the Ravidas death came? Some of the Ravidas opponents organized a meeting. He organized a meeting away from his village and invited Guruji in it. Guruji already understands that trick of those people. They started the meeting by mistake their partner Bhalla Nath is killed in the place of Guruji. After a while, when Guruji blows a notch in his room, everyone is taken aback. The killer were very shocked by seeing Guruji is alive. Then they ran to the place of murderer when they found the dead body of their own companion called Bhallanath instead of the Guruji. Follower of Ravidas ji believe that after 120 or 126 years, Ravidas ji gives up his body on his own. According to the people, he breathed his last in Varanasi in 1540. Yes. This is of this is till the Ravidas. Now I am starting of Mahadevi Akka. Mahadevi Akka. Mahadevi Akka was one of the early female poets of Kannada literature. The term Akka means the elder sister is an honorific given by the great Lingayat saint. He was seen as an inspirational woman in the Kannada literature and in the history of Karnataka. He considered the god Shiva Chenna Mallikarjuna as her husband. The statue of Akka Mahadevi constructed in the temple at her birthplace. Sir, what it pronounced Uddutadi or Uttadi?
Udutadi.
Uddutadi, yes.
That's
These
known,
are
yeah.
yes, these are the pictures situated in his birthplace, which was constructed by a people.
Yeah, continue.
Yes, but Mahadevi Akka was born in Uddutadi near Shivamogga in the Indian state of Karnataka around 11th century. Some scholars suggested that she was born in the couple named Nirmal Shetty and Sumati Shetty, who were both devoted of Parashiva. Western sources claim that little is known as about her life, though it has been the subject of Indian hagiography, folk, and mythological claims based on the oral tradition and her own lyrics. One of her lyrics of instance appears to record her experience of leaving her place of her birth and the family in order to pursue Shiva. She is considered by modern scholars to be prominent figure in the field of female a household name in Karnataka. She wrote she was a woman only in the name and that her mind, body and soul belonged to Shiva. During the time of strife and political uncertainty in the 12th century, she chose spiritual enlightenment and stood by her choice. She took part in the convocations of the learned, such as the Anubhavam in Kalyana, to debate a philosophy of enlightenment of moksha, termed by her Araivu. In search of her eternal soulmate, Lord Shiva, she made animal, flowers, and birds her friends and companions, rejecting family's life and worldly attachments. Works done by Mahadevi Akkas were like Bhakti Moment poem. She does a Bhakti Moment poets based on the use of Ankita. About 350 lyrical poems or vachanas are attributed to Mahadevi Akka. Her works frequently use the metaphor of elect or adulterous loves to describe her devotion to Shiva. Akka's pursuit of enlightenment is recorded in the poem of the simple language but a great intellectual rigor. Her poetry explores the rejections of mortal love in the favor of everlasting love of God. Translations. Uh, uh, the books of Mahadevi Akkas were mostly translated by the A.K. Ramarajuna, first popularized the Vachanas by translating them into the collection of called Speaking of Shiva. Post-colonial scholar Tejaswini Niranjana criticized this translation as rendering the Vachanas into the modern universalized poetry ready to consume by the West in citing the translation in 1992. Kannada translator Varnamala Vishwanath is currently working on a new English translation which may be published as a part of the Murthy Classical Library. Some of the books written by Mahadevi Akkas are songs of Shiva, Bhairavi, Akka Mahadevi ki Kavitaएं, Akka Vachangalu. Her death was believed to have traveled towards the end of her life to the Sirisalium mountain where she lived as an ascetic and eventually died in 1160. Thank you.
Okay. So on that note, we can stop for today, right?
Yes.
And we'll discuss these poets in the next class. Clear? So have a good day and see you next week.